That I've been living in fear. Fear of uncertainty, of not being needed, of discovering I might be wrong about everything. Wilhelm nodded. Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming who you really are rather than who you think you should be. It requires surrendering the false self we've constructed. But what if I don't know who I really am? Then you're exactly where you need to be. The real self reveals itself through living, not through planning. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the Riverside neighborhood, watching children play in the pocket park that had emerged from community conversations. The development was taking shape, slower than traditional projects, but more organically, like something growing rather than being built. He and Elena had become partners in more ways than one, their relationship unfolding with the same natural intelligence that had guided their professional collaboration. They'd learned to trust the process, to respond to what emerged rather than forcing predetermined outcomes. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. The Richardson Project wants to hire us. They heard about our revolutionary approach. Marcus smiled, remembering the man who used to schedule bathroom breaks and panic when computers malfunctioned. That person wasn't gone. His attention to detail and strategic thinking remained valuable, but he was no longer the only voice in the conversation. He looked up at the sky, vast and unpredictable, then at the neighborhood taking shape around him, through the mysterious alchemy of human intention and divine timing. Jung had been right. Do nothing differently, yet watch your entire life fall into place. The difference was learning to recognize that falling into place didn't mean everything became easy. It meant everything became meaningful, even the difficulties, even the uncertainties, even the spaces between the blueprint lines where real life happened. Marcus pulled out his father's photograph one more time, understanding finally that the empty spaces weren't flaws to be corrected but invitations to be explored. Life, he'd learned, was less about building according to plan and more about discovering what wanted to be built through you. The sun set over Riverside, painting the sky in colors no architect could have designed, but any human heart could appreciate. Marcus walked home, no longer rushing toward a predetermined destination, but moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to trust the path itself. 2 months into his experiment in strategic non-action, Marcus's life had become a study in beautiful chaos. His apartment, once a monument to minimalist control, now contained books, lots of books. Dr. Wilhelm had been lending him volumes on philosophy, psychology, and what the old man called the forgotten art of allowing. The professional changes were equally dramatic. Marcus found himself assigned to the Riverside Development Project, the firm's most challenging account. Previous teams had failed because the community opposed every proposal. The residents, led by a fierce advocate named Elena Vasquez, had successfully blocked 3 different developments. Traditional Marcus would have researched Elena's weaknesses, prepared counterarguments, and launched a campaign to overcome resistance. Current Marcus simply requested a meeting with no agenda beyond listening. Elena arrived expecting battle and found conversation instead. She spoke passionately about preserving the neighborhood's character, about families who'd lived there for generations, about the small businesses that gave the area its soul. Marcus listened, asked genuine questions, and discovered something remarkable. Elena wasn't anti-development. She was pro-community. What if we designed something that enhanced what already exists instead of replacing it? Marcus heard himself asking. The question surprised him as much as it surprised Elena. Over coffee that extended into dinner, they sketched ideas on napkins. Elena had studied urban planning before becoming a community organizer. Marcus had architecture in his blood, inherited from his father. Together, they envisioned something neither could have conceived alone. The synchronicities multiplied. Elena's brother owned a sustainable construction company. Marcus's college roommate had just started a firm specializing in adaptive reuse. Dr. Wilhelm, it turned out, had been the neighborhood's unofficial historian for 40 years and possessed photographs documenting its evolution. It's like the universe is conspiring to help, Elena mused during one of their late-night planning sessions. Jung would call it synchronicity. Marcus replied, surprising himself with how naturally the concept now flowed from his lips. The project proposal they submitted was revolutionary, not just a development, but a regeneration that honored the past while embracing the future. Community spaces, affordable housing, preserved historic facades, and new businesses that complemented existing ones. But the real transformation was personal. Marcus found himself thinking about Elena at odd moments. Her laugh when she discovered he'd never tried the tamales from Mrs. Rodriguez's cart. Her fierce concentration when sketching improvements to the neighborhood playground. The way she saw potential where others saw problems. The night before the city council presentation, Marcus couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, his old companion, but from excitement. For the first time in his career, he was presenting something he believed in rather than something he'd been hired to sell. Dr. Wilhelm had warned him that synchronicity often accelerated before major life changes. When you align with life's natural flow, the old man had said, the current becomes stronger. Be prepared for rapids. As Marcus walked to City Hall the next morning, he felt like a different person inhabiting his same body. The control-obsessed architect was still there, but quieter now, no longer drowning out the deeper intelligence that had always been present but never trusted. Whatever happened at the presentation, Marcus realized he'd already won something more valuable than any contract. He'd learned to collaborate with life instead of commanding it. The city council chamber buzzed with tension. Developers in expensive suits sat across from residents in their everyday clothes, the divide as clear as a battle line. Marcus and Elena took their seats in the neutral zone, their presentation materials modest compared to the elaborate displays surrounding them. When their turn came, Marcus did something unprecedented. He invited Elena to speak first and positioned himself not as the expert presenting to subjects, but as a collaborator sharing a vision. Elena spoke about roots and growth, about neighborhoods as living organisms that could evolve without losing their essence. Marcus followed with technical details, but framed as possibilities rather than certainties. Together, they painted a picture of development as partnership rather than conquest. The questions from the council were probing but respectful. Other developers had arrived with answers. Marcus and Elena brought authentic curiosity about challenges they hadn't yet considered. When Councilwoman Martinez asked about parking concerns, they admitted they needed more community input. When Councilman Torres raised questions about gentrification, they proposed safeguards they were still developing. We're not here to sell you a completed vision, Elena concluded. We're here to begin a conversation about what this community could become if we listen to what it's already telling us. The vote was unanimous approval for the next phase, something no previous proposal had achieved. Walking out of City Hall, Marcus felt the same disorientation he'd experienced months ago when his computer wouldn't start. But this time, the uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. Coffee? Elena asked, and Marcus realized he'd been hoping she would. They ended up at Mrs. Rodriguez's cart, eating tamales and discussing everything except the project. Elena had grown up wanting to be an architect, but switched to community organizing after her father lost his small business to aggressive development. Marcus had inherited his father's blueprints, but had never understood their true meaning until now. Your father drew buildings, Elena observed, studying the photograph Marcus now carried in his wallet. But he was really designing spaces for human connection. That evening, Dr. Wilhelm closed his bookshop early and invited Marcus for tea in the back room, surrounded by books that seemed to contain all the world's wisdom. So what have you learned? The old man asked. Marcus considered the question. That control is an illusion. That listening is more powerful than speaking. That life has its own intelligence if we're quiet enough to hear it. And Marcus Chen had built his life like a Swiss watch, every gear precisely placed, every movement calculated. At 35, he was the youngest partner at Henderson and Associates, owned a penthouse overlooking the city, and maintained a schedule so rigid that his assistant booked bathroom breaks. His walls displayed certificates, awards, and a single photograph of his deceased father holding a blueprint, the only decoration that wasn't strategically chosen by an interior designer. The morning everything began to unravel started like any other. Marcus arrived at his office at 6:47 am. exactly 13 minutes before his first meeting. But his computer wouldn't start. The IT department said it would take hours to fix. His carefully orchestrated day, client presentations, merger negotiations, quarterly reviews, crumbled like a house of cards. Just use someone else's office, suggested his assistant Sarah. But Marcus couldn't work in chaos. Everything had to be perfect, controlled, predictable. He'd spent years building systems to eliminate surprises, creating backup plans for his backup plans. By noon, Marcus found himself wandering the streets, something he hadn't done without purpose in decades. The city looked different at street level, messier, more alive. He passed a small bookshop he'd never noticed despite walking this route for 8 years. Through the window, he glimpsed an elderly man reading peacefully, surrounded by towers of books that seemed to defy gravity. The man looked up and smiled, as if he'd been waiting. Marcus felt an inexplicable pull to enter, but his phone buzzed with urgent emails. Clients needed answers. Deals hung in the balance. His entire carefully constructed world demanded his immediate attention. He turned away from the bookshop, but the image of the peaceful reader lingered. That night, lying in his minimalist bedroom, Marcus stared at the ceiling and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. Not the calculated risk of a business venture, but deep, existential uncertainty about whether all his control had actually controlled anything at all. His last thought before sleep was of his father's blueprint, not the building it represented, but the empty spaces between the lines where unexpected beauty might flourish. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus wondered what would happen if he stopped trying to fill every empty space with predetermined outcomes. The next morning, his computer worked perfectly, but something inside Marcus had shifted. He sat at his desk, fingers poised over the keyboard, and for reasons he couldn't explain, decided to do absolutely nothing differently. 3 weeks passed. Marcus maintained his exact routine: same coffee order, same walking route, same meeting schedule, but internally, he'd stopped pushing. Where once he would have interrupted colleagues mid-sentence to redirect conversations, he listened. Where he would have immediately solved problems, he paused. The results were bewildering. The Morrison account, which he'd been aggressively pursuing for months, suddenly called to schedule a meeting, not because of his persistent follow-ups, but because their previous consultant had recommended Henderson and Associates to a friend, who mentioned it to Morrison's CEO at a charity gala. A chain of connections Marcus had never orchestrated. "It's like you've developed a sixth sense," Sarah observed, watching him navigate a particularly complex negotiation by saying very little. The clients filled the silence with their actual concerns, revealing what Marcus's previous aggressive questioning had never uncovered. But the real mystery was the bookshop. Every day, Marcus passed it on his lunch walk. The elderly man was always there, reading different books, but always looking up at exactly the moment Marcus appeared in the window. It became a strange ritual, the nod of acknowledgement between strangers who somehow weren't strangers. On Thursday, Marcus's biggest rival, Thompson, cornered him at the elevator. "What's your game, Chen? You're winning clients without even trying. It's unnerving." Marcus realized Thompson was right. He wasn't trying, at least not in the way he'd always understood trying. He was present, attentive, but not forcing outcomes. It felt like learning to breathe underwater, discovering he'd been holding his breath his entire career. That afternoon, the Morrison deal closed itself. Marcus had prepared his usual 40-slide presentation, but Morrison's team arrived with their decision already made. "We like working with people who listen more than they talk," the CEO explained. "Rare quality these days." Walking home, Marcus finally entered the bookshop. The elderly man, whose name tag read Dr. Wilhelm, looked up from a leather-bound journal. "Jung's collected works," Wilhelm said, gesturing to the book. He wrote about meaningful coincidences, synchronicity, the idea that when we stop forcing life to bend to our will, it begins to reveal its own intelligence. Marcus felt goosebumps. "I've been experiencing something like that." Wilhelm smiled. "The question isn't whether synchronicity exists, but whether we're quiet enough to notice it. Most people live so loudly, planning, controlling, demanding, that they drown out life's natural rhythm. So what do I do? Exactly what you've been doing. Nothing differently. But watch more carefully. That night, Marcus looked at his father's blueprint with new eyes. The empty spaces weren't floors to be filled but breathing room for the unexpected. His father hadn't just designed buildings. He designed space for life to unfold naturally.